Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 984th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Suneil Sanzgiri and Tausif Noor. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Suneil Sanzgiri is an artist, researcher, and filmmaker, spanning experimental video and film, animations, essays, and installations. His work contends with questions of identity, heritage, culture, and diaspora in relation to structural violence and anti-colonial struggles across the global South. Sanzgiri's films offer sonic and visual journeys through family history, local mythology, and colonial legacies of extraction in Goa, India, where his family originates. Sanzgiri's work has been screened extensively at festivals and venues around the world and is the recipient of numerous awards. And our host today, Tausif Noor, is a critic, curator, and PhD student in modern art history at the University of California, Berkeley. His criticism and essays have appeared in Art Forum, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books, among other venues, as well as in various artist catalogs and monographs. He is a recipient of a 2023 Grace Dudley Prize for Arts Writing from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, as well as a 2023 Andy Warhol Foundation Creative Capital Arts Writers Grant for short-form writing. And we're, of course, extremely lucky to have him as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tausif to get us started.
I'd actually like to let Suneil have the first word.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Tausif. I'd like to open today's talk by acknowledging the Brooklyn Rail's silence on the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people at the hands of the occupying Zionist forces, which has ethnically cleansed over 23,000 lives and counting and forcefully displaced over 1.7 million people. This is 105 days during which the opportunity to denounce publicly the intentional mass starvation, targeting of journalists, pillaging of homes, bombing of hospitals and schools, eradication of culture, the stripping and humiliation of Palestinian men, the consistent burning, maiming, and amputating of children, and the repression of artists, academics, and students engaged in peaceful boycott efforts and legitimate critique of the Israeli war crimes perpetuated and sustained by the United States itself. And to say, no, we do not support this. What a basic question we must face. Do you support this genocide? And yet so many of our institutions only respond with deafening silence. Silence why? Silence for whom? Whom might your silence protect? Certainly not Palestinians. Entire issues of the Brooklyn Rail dedicated to state repression elsewhere, voices on voices, but so few Palestinian voices. Will you look back at this moment with embarrassment, Brooklyn Rail, or will you heed the call of your readers so deeply hurt by your silence? There's an opportunity, Brooklyn Rail. You can still denounce this genocide, this massive stain on humanity and our collective souls, and loudly and with conviction call for an end to the apartheid of Palestinians and demand a ceasefire. And we invite you, the Brooklyn Rail, to join in with so many of our other beloved New York organizations and cultural spaces and commit to PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. We all have blood on our hands. The least we can do is loudly refuse that blood. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your statement, Suneil, which I fully support, and I stand behind it. It shows that for you, decolonization and liberation are not just simply intellectual exercises, but real political forms of praxis. And I'm grateful to you for clarifying how Palestinian liberation is essential to all of our liberation. And I'm grateful to stand with you and others in solidarity with the Palestinian cause. So with that in mind, I'd like to start thinking about solidarity and how it operates for you in your work. So as an artist, a filmmaker, and a researcher, in addition to someone who's extremely politically active, you've just committed to the Strike Germany call to refused to participate in the Berlinale, which you were selected for, and I really commend you for that. I want to think about how solidarity operates in your work as a sort of formal question and as a political question, because I think for you, all of these things are tied together. And one of the things that you so brilliantly do in your latest film is to, and if you have not seen it, it's part of Suneil's exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum here, the Earth Grows Gold, which is open until May. One of the things that you do that I think is really brilliant in this work is, and you've written about it in an essay for the Brooklyn Museum, is to think about solidarity as, quote, an intricate mess of possibility. So an intricate mess is, it seems like a little bit of a complicated thing to unpack, but really for you in formal terms, this means bringing together CGI, it means bringing together archival material, film stills, interviews, fiction, music, poetry, all of these things as a way to demonstrate what you term as the contradictions and crises that and complexities and paradoxes that sort of haunt the question of solidarity. So one of the things that you encourage us to do in your essay and through your work is to quote, propel ourselves into these complexities and paradoxes, right? So you invoke a term by Fred Moten, which is called, which is the insovereign politics. The insovereign politics is someone who can really show us with the strength of your desire how to break apart the world that we currently live in and really reimagine and build a new one. So world building is not just a term from science fiction, but it's actually a political sort of move. So I'd like to begin talking about solidarity as messy, solidarity as complicated, but solidarity is something that we are obligated to do by moving through contradiction.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about everything that you brought together in that question. And I think that one of the things is that, a common refrain is like solidarity is not a verb, right? And that it's a practice. But it is just both from my own experience in organizing efforts and then also studying history, understand how fragmented movements become and how possibilities where new opportunities were open to pry open various forms of repression or oppression have been stifled by opportunism, by and we see this play out both historically but also in the present, where you have the grifter, right? And so you have many historical grifters that have existed throughout, who often become sort of figures of the state. And so I'm interested in that, in thinking about both the moment of possibility that was engineered by people, the confluence of moments, specifically thinking of Afro-Asianism, right? This is like what is called Afro-Asianism, and the moments of possibility that were birthed in these spaces. But then I also think of the aftermath of these moments, right? And I think the aftermath is key in understanding, right? Because there tends to be such a fetishization of the past, and there tends to be such a fetishization of liberation struggles and anti-colonial struggles, and not understanding also the limits of all of these moments. And how, well, for instance, we could take the issue of caste as an example, right? And I think caste is something that is complex in as much as we take this like question of caste and this question of like decolonization, right? Because for so much the uh, anti-colonial struggles were by and large led by upper caste, so-called upper caste, Brahmins, and you know, Dalit folks would often say, while you were off fighting the British, you were our oppressor, right? Like you were the ones who are oppressor. So understanding this question of like de-Brahminization alongside decolonization and understanding how the question of decolonization gets co-opted so easily now by the state, right? There's so many moments of understanding and learning and unlearning that are possible within these moments, but also and emphatically, understanding that like caste must be involved within this critique of the colonial era, right? And of colonialism and of ongoing issues of the persecution of Dalits as well as Muslims in the subcontinent, right? So that's just one example, right? I mean, we have so many other examples of the mess of possibility. As I write in my essay, I think about the time during the 2020 uprisings, right? Where you had, yeah, possibility, but then you also had so many sort of coalitions coming together, Black and Asian kind of coalitions, and emphatically stating that like things do not have to be the way that they are, right? And that there is another, the common refrain, another world is possible. But an understanding that like, um, solidarity is not conditional, right? That it's not an exchange. It's not, well, I'll fight for you if you fight for me. That solidarity is and must be unconditional. But it also requires a lot of humbling oneself, right? So
Right.
yeah, so I think that, the way that that plays out, I guess, in the film too. I was very lucky to have some incredible collaborators. I'll name them Shami Ali Naeem, who's a Philadelphia-based poet of Hyderabadi descent and is Muslim as well. And the collaboration with her on the script for that film was also a lot of letting go and like letting the kind of process of that collaboration play out in significant ways, in ways that like maybe I wasn't necessarily um, as open to at certain points and had to let certain things go in order to honor her work, right? And to honor that because I often work by myself on my own films for budgetary reasons mostly. And then also working with people like Martha Kadambi and Booker Stardrum and others and really having a lot of trust in people. So I think trust is important in this question of solidarity, but trust must be earned and must be built. And so I think a lot about that also within the materiality of film itself, of the 16mm film, specifically because of how miserable it is to work with 16mm film. So I have to have a lot of trust in that process. And often the material of the film will push back against me in very specific ways, working with 16mm film across borders, is like akin to like smuggling drugs in. And so there's a lot of, difficulty within the materiality of film, but it's also, I think about this idea of like the development of the film as sort of akin to this idea of like political development, right? One might not always see the immediate fruits of their labor, right? One might not always see the immediate, a result of one's labor because there's a time delay. We're so used to instantaneous video and imagery, right? Whether it's our phones or digital cameras, right? We're so used to this instantaneousness, and film requires a significant level of patience and trust and belief and letting go of control, right? Because
Right.
it's often the things that you can't control within the material of the medium that end up being the most important in the film, at least for experimental practices, right? But that's also to say that solidarity is an experimental practice, right? Because there's no one way to do it, and we should be weary of any pre-described ways of knowing or thinking or acting in that result, right? That solidarity is also about questioning. We must question our solidarities just as much as we reaffirm them. So in that
Precisely.
way, it's a contradiction, right? Like in that sense, we
Right.
must question the solidarities, and we must also
Be unconditional
unconditional.
in providing them. And I think that's the sort of generative aspect that you really materialize through your film. So let's back up for a little bit. And Chloe, would you mind if we were able to put up the slides so that those who might not be familiar with Suneil's practice can sort of get a sense of how he works with materials. So just to say that, Suneil, primarily you began your artistic practice and research practice through cinema and filmmaking, whether that was desktop cinema or through, as you said, a 16mm film. So and it's often, most frequently, a combination of both. So you're taking different media, so film, CGI, you're using Google Walkthrough in some of your earlier films, and the interview form. You've interviewed your father who was born in Goa and emigrated to the United States and like shortly after Indian independence, but not Goa's independence. So in this interstitial time period. And he features as a protagonist in the early set of films which deal with diaspora. So I'm interested in, so at 2019's At Home But Not at Home, and then also Letter for Your, sorry, at Home and Not at Home, but also in Letter from Your Far Off Country, and then later Golden Jubilee. There, your father features really heavily, and your films, I would say, approach history as this kind of labile material. So you're playing with these different formats and different technologies in order to, I think, make the distant past more proximate. So one of the things I wanted to pick up on that you've so brilliantly stated was that often when we look back to the revolutionary past, it's with this kind of wistfulness and nostalgia. And I think that what you're able to do by playing with different forms is actually make that past more accessible, more proximate, and sort of shed that left melancholy, we might call it. So in regard to form, for this particular exhibition, what we're looking at right now, Red Clay, Stretched Water, is a mixed media sculpture. So, someone who's working from film and desktop cinema and digital and analog film into something like architecture. And I think that one of the things that I find very interesting about your practice as an artist is you've had to actually adapt and learn new things and learn how to put together an exhibition and installation, whether that's at Pioneer Works or now at your first museum installation. How do you sort of negotiate this transition from the cinematic medium to the sculptural medium? Because one of the things that I would argue is that your decision to make the sculpture, which evokes some of the bamboo scaffolding that's really common throughout India, or even scaffolding in general that's done throughout all over the world, but often in these developmental projects, is that your films are also structured in a way, right? You're working through a combination of different media, whether it's CGI and animation and archival footage, and putting those together in order to, in this sort of essay film tradition, evoke an emotional response, to evoke a certain form of politics. So I'm interested in how you went from that kind of thinking into a three-dimensional architectural sort of form.
Yeah, super interesting question. I mean, I think that, for instance, a sculpture, right, was a way for me to think about proximity to images in in different ways. I mean, what I didn't want to do was just to have a kind of, table with like these, precious images on the kind of vitrine, right, the research vitrine. And in this way, these images, which are printed on plexi, have this kind of quality where there's a level of what the image shows and what it obscures, and so the image reveals itself only in proximity to the body. Within one's distance, right? So this idea of like engaging with these histories at a distance, or dealing with questions of diaspora and identity and memory from a distance, right? So, for instance, one of the images, which is kind of closer to the ground, it's a 3D image of a 3D rendering of yeah, this towards the bottom down here of Saint Francis Xavier, who was one of the chief architects, no pun intended, of the Goan Inquisition. Many people know in the 1500s, so many people know about the Spanish Inquisition, but there was also a Goan Inquisition that forced non-Christians to convert, and would burn them at the stake if they did not. And so there's a sculpture, or not a sculpture, a statue of St. Francis Xavier that's sort of crumbled into the mud. And it's actually a still from Golden Jubilee, my previous work, but I wanted to highlight it here. And so the viewer, in order to see this image, the viewer actually has to crouch down and get to the level of that fallen statue in order for the image to really reveal itself. And so there's all these sorts of layers within that distance, physical proximity, and also like what the viewer can and cannot ever really touch or see. There's the kind of it's not like a podium. It's like the basically so you don't step onto the sculpture, right? There's like a good like 2 feet of room. And the whole thing is also situated in water, in moving water.
Right.
So, I wanted to invoke these like natural layers of the bamboo, of the water, and also of this twine and rope that is that, holding some of the bamboo pieces together, but also that this is also a sort of physical manifestation of that mess of possibility that we talked about earlier, right? So a lot of these images are also of anti-colonial publications that were circulated, but also of images of people like oh my God, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name right now. He was a Goan anti-colonial sort of freedom fighter that fought in Mozambique, and Aquino de Braganza is his name. Aquino de Braganza. He knew everyone from Frantz Fanon to Samora Michel to Julius Nair, and was like a strong he was a part of these conferences that took place, these conferences after Bandung, right? So Bandung is often thought of as this sort of first kind of Afro-Asian solidarity meeting, which of course it actually wasn't. There were others before that. It was just that first one of its scale. And there were many after, and a lot of them were for the kind of conferences against the Portuguese. So like anti-colonial nationalist conferences. And so Aquino de Braganza, there's an image of him with Mario Pinto de Andrade, who, for those who know, was also the husband of the filmmaker Sarah Maldoror, who had made the film Sambizanga, which is also in my film. I take an excerpt from it. So there's all these kind of connections that get made. And the I don't know who this person is, but there's all these strings, these ropes, these kind of untethering of this material. So the material of the kind of the thing that's sort of attaching the architecture of these images together is actually beginning to unravel. I also wanted to evoke some sort of like Gothic sensibility within it too. So it has this kind of I grew up in the South, and so we have lots of these trees that have the kind of very Gothic sensibility to them. So I was interested in all of these things, and also approaching some of the research material in a much more architectural manner. I think of it as like scaffolding for the images too. So it's kind of like the way in which these images are held up by this material, which, as you mentioned, is also seen in everything from like impromptu bus stops or bus stations, shelters, to protest sites, to also community film screenings, right? It's the language of that improvisational nature. And so I think of these questions of solidarity as also in anti-colonial strategies as improvisatory at the same time.
Precisely.
Or what Fred Moten would call affect fugibility, or affect fugibility. So this kind of desire, this nebulous desire that cannot be contained or captured.
Right. And I think exactly what you mentioned with the sort of improvisational temporary quality of the structure is mimicked in the sort of actual history of Bandung and Afro-Asia. As you mentioned, in your essay, one of the sort of lasting legacies of Bandung, if we can call it that, if we can call it in strictly political terms, was the non-aligned movement. And India was involved in that, along with Yugoslavia and other nations. But I think, again, there's a tendency in contemporary culture and contemporary history writing, and I've noticed particularly in art history, to be at once fetishistic about the Bandung moment, but then also a little bit, again, nostalgic. It's like, oh, look at what we've lost. Can we retrieve it again? And the way that you are making things proximate is through people. And I say this because in your previous films, you've interviewed your father. Your father, was approaching his 70s, and he all of a sudden one day kind of started telling you and your siblings about the life that he lived and his sort of memories of anti-colonialism, his memory of Gandhi being assassinated, these kinds of things. So in that way, all of these memories became so much more proximate because they were sort of filtered through this, person who was close to you. In the same way, in your latest film, Two Refusals, Would We Recognize Ourselves Unbroken? This is a two-channel experimental film, and you, as in your other films, you interweave narratives. You take archival material, you bring in interviews with revolutionary figures. I was actually so moved by your interview with Sharada Sawaikar, who was a female Goan liberation fighter who's jailed when she was 17. And she talks about, being 17, having her teeth smashed, seeing other people beaten, people crying out for their mothers. And those memories are living with her. And she's depicted right there on that screen. And when we think about history in these very material bodily terms, that history lives inside people and that it can be lost when people die because there isn't, let's say, a sort of archival record in the same way. I think what you were able to do through the interview format and through the sort of imaginative aspect of your work, to bring in fiction and poetry and literature, and intersperse that with archival footage, with films that are incredibly important to you. So we have Sandi Zanga, but we also have Khwaja Ahmed Abbas's 1969 film, Saat Hindustani. You're taking all these different forms of memory making and memory keeping and bringing them together in such a way that even if there isn't one route to the past, there are multiple routes to the past. And I think that in so doing, in making your work so intermedial, what it allows us to do is chart sort of new ways, new possibilities for what other forms could take, the future could take, what solidarity could look like, right? So it's I think an expansive way of approaching history as, again, this labile material that can be rearranged. Again, one of the really moving things about this particular film, Two Refusals, is the centrality of the liberation fighter Sita Vali, who you interview her brother who survives her. They're both involved in the Communist Party. They're born in Angola. Their parents are Goans. Currently, Edgar Valley, her brother lives in Portugal, but he's talking. You went to Portugal and you interviewed him, and he spoke to you about how Sita really lived a life of unshakable conviction, as he says. You know, it's a person who was alive, flesh and blood, really believed in the cause of liberation, who went to Angola, who was emotionally invested, as you know, he says, and goes to Rwanda, in fact, first. And it was one person among others, but one person who we can sort of follow, and that person's conviction. And in making that history so proximate through the story of Sita Valley, through Sharada Swaikar, it doesn't feel to me, after watching these films, it doesn't feel to me that it's so messy and so impossible, right? It feels that, you know, all it takes is that kind of belief, that kind of political conviction, and that kind of bravery to stand up and say, you know, it does not have to be like this. Decolonization is possible, liberation is possible, and liberation is for people. So I think that these various strategies that you do to make history more proximate and to make that past more accessible shows up in so many formal ways. And I wonder for you how you actually go about doing so much research and sourcing interviews. You know, it's one thing to go through an archive and look at photographs and read books, but it's another thing entirely to, you know, to sit and talk to somebody about their experiences in revolution. So what is that like?
Um, well, I want to go back to actually something you just said about Sita Velej and this idea of it not being so messy, right? But the thing about Sita was, yes, she lived a life of revolutionary conviction. Everything she did was for the people. She was a doctor, right? She just as much as she was a revolutionary. And after she helped to liberate Angola, right, she helped to establish the MPLA. The MPLA would not be around if it wasn't for her. Obviously, it wasn't just her, it was many people, but she really was instrumental in helping to win people over to the liberation struggle. But after Angola was liberated in 1975, and after the fall of the Portuguese dictatorship, the Salazar dictatorship, Sita went to the countryside in Angola, and she was a doctor. And she saw how much the revolution had actually failed the people of Angola because there were still so many unhoused people, so many hungry people, so many people who were dying from diseases, right? And she started claiming to the government, right, the MPLA itself, that they were not living up to the revolutionary ideals that they claimed, right, that they were failing their own people. And that is what got her killed, right? That she was disappeared by the government, along with some 10,000 to 30,000 other people. She was accused of staging a coup in 1977. She married an Angolan man named Jose Van Dunham. And they have they have a son. Their son's name is Shay. And he did not grow up with any parents uh, because they were both murdered by the state. And it was because of her revolutionary conviction that the state disappeared her. No one knows what happened to her. There's some sort of guesses as to where her body and her remains were, but no one knows where these remains are. It was a mass killing of tens of thousands of people, also helped and aided
Mhm.
by the Cubans. And this is where it gets messy, right? Because as Edgar says in the film, Cubans were revolutionaries, right? The Cubans helped to liberate Angola. Um, Fidel Castro personally came over to Angola during the anti-colonial liberation struggle and helped to defeat the Portuguese, right? And brought forces over there. This is like one of his lasting legacies is solidarity. However, in 1977, when Agostinho Neto, who was the president, he called Fidel Castro and said, "There's a coup in progress. You need to come help me." And of course, they were also fighting UNITA, which was backed by the CIA. So they were fighting the US imperialists, and they were also fighting supposedly dissent from within. But it was not dissent from within. They were saying, "You are not living up. Your people are dying, and you're living over here with all your food and all your, your castles." And I mean, they weren't castles, but of course, like basically saying like, you're not doing enough for the people, right? And and then the Cubans came and they brought their tanks and they started killing people in the streets anonymously. They just started shooting people, anyone who was like running away, right? And so it was this horrific massacre that you could not even talk about in Angola. For 30 years, there was a silence that you could not speak of these atrocities. And it got to the point where now there is official acknowledgement of these massacres by the state, because the MPLA is still in power, right? But there's a demand for this return of the remains of the disappeared, but they have no idea where these remains are. But the government claimed that they found the remains of Sita Valej, gave them to the family, and the family was like, "We want an independent investigation onto like a forensic investigation." The MPLA said, "No, these are her remains, take them or leave them." And what ended up happening is um they finally got an independent forensic investigation, and it turned they weren't her bones. And so the government lied about her bones. So I'm thinking about all of these processes of exhumation, of
Right.
retrieval, and this goes into the very fabric of the film, the materiality of the film, where I actually buried 16 mm film of images of Sita Valej and of the liberation movement. I buried them underground and let the worms
Mhm.
eat the emulsion of the film. And so there's a very direct connection about this like exhumation of the remains of an image, right? It's the remains of the image. And so it's baked into the materiality of the film itself. These processes of burial and retrieval and exhumation. In other places, I also take 16 mm film of images of Bandung and of the liberation struggles and of the MPLA and of Agostinho Neto and all these people, and I cut them up, I chop them up, right, with scissors and kind of splice them back together in this frenetic um, way that is very visceral. You get a very visceral reaction seeing all these incompatible images that do not belong together, right? So it's more than just the montage. It's more than just the cut. It's more than just that type of, um, you know, technique. And this is a very material element that is not dissimilar to this idea of nation state building, which is a cutting up, right? And
Right.
and of a territorialization and a deterritorialization. And so I think about that within the image and how the image could reflect that viscerality um, of that violence, right? The violence of
Right.
borders.
Right. Thank you. I mean, that's so brilliant because I think that is exactly what I wanted to touch on, which is what is possible through art that might not be possible in quote unquote real life, right? So we can't go back and change history, but through the manipulation of material, you're suggesting the possibility of at least thinking about how we think about the past and contemplating what other possibilities, rearrangements, forms could be there. So if the story all over post, anti-colonial revolutions from the 40s into the 70s and ongoing, is that the nation state becomes the primary form through which to sort of transact politics. And the nation state also has its limits. We can also just think of the nation state as a form. It doesn't have to look like these borders. It's a confection. It can look like something else. And at the same time, as the Palestinian liberation cause shows us, the nation state is still a dream for many people, right? So the way that I think the past meets up and contradicts and, rubs up against the present in such a way that it creates a new fissure, that is what I think your films sort of illustrate, and not illustrate, they actively sort of engage the viewer in doing, right? I have very little sort of patience for the sort of imagining otherwise industrial complex. And at the same time, I still think that through these kinds of formal techniques and real serious consideration of the failures of post-colonial nation states, of the failures of what turns out to be and this is the story all over military dictatorships, or in the case of India, Hindutva politics. It's not the sort of same aspirations that Fanon and Amy Césaire had. And at the same time, it's our present. It's what we have to deal with. I mean, I would say, that you have a very Benjaminian conception of how history operates. It's like different moments flash up before us. The catastrophe is ongoing, but that's precisely why it's so imperative ethically and politically to look back and look forward at the same time. And I think because we've talked a little bit about your sort of archival impulses and the way that you've researched and put things together, I want to sort of turn to something that this still invokes, which is the looking forward, the imagination or the fictive strategies that you use. So the narration of this film, which again, the script was so beautifully written with Shaming Ali, and you can sense that poetic voice because, and a poetic approach to history. There's a lot of wonderful jazz scores. There's a lot of amazing kind of sonic reverberations and sonic patternings that help to create this affective image of again, not just the past, but a potential future. And I think that in using this kind of affective mode of presenting history as told through the perspective of our narrator, who another aspect that I loved about it was that it's in Konkani, I believe, right? In Konkani, and I think like this sonic approach that adds this affective dimension to the images helps to suggest, again, not just imagining otherwise, but actually like building. And one of the things that it really just rings again is Edgar Vallée's statement when he's talking about Sita, his sister. He says, "We thought it was possible to change the world, and we thought we were really able to do this." I have such a, I have such a soft spot for how he phrases that, because he says it in the past tense. We thought it was possible to change the world. And you might think that perhaps he doesn't believe that anymore. But in fact, in going through the memory of Sita and really talking about how Sita's conviction drove her to all these things, again, if one person could commit to this and do so, through her work as a doctor, but also through her work as a revolutionary, why wouldn't it be possible for there to be 100,000 Sitas, right? And I think that is the key to not romanticizing the past and not being nostalgic. Revolutionary figures are important, but we risk idolization and fetishization and exceptionalization when we consider that there might not be these exceptional figures. In fact, like there are people right now who haven't yet been born in Palestine, in Kashmir, in the Congo, everywhere that will change the world in that way. And because we know that, because we know that potential, because we know that these people exist as they are right now, it offers something like a practical, logical reason why you can't give up on anti-colonial liberation.
I love that so much. Whew, sitting with that. I mean that's it's one of the true horrors of colonialism, and by colonialism I include the Israeli occupation of Palestine, is that we will never know what would have been possible in its place. That entire worlds, every single death, every single child that has been murdered by the Israeli state is an entire universe, an entire world of possibility that was extinguished. Um, and that is not to say that there will not still and continue to be new worlds that blossom, but just as new worlds blossom with the potential of so many Sitas, right, who might take up a cause, take up the cause of liberation, which is to say everyone's liberation. Take up the cause of liberation is to say that for every one that opens up, so many thousands have been extinguished.
Mm.
And so I think that's why we hold on to what we have, right? That's why we hold on to these flames while we have, because it's the least we can do is the absolute flame and the fire that we have to carry with us in these struggles, right?
Right.
Is the memory. It's the memory. I think Bissan, the Palestinian journalist, right, who every single day we wake up and we wait to see if she's still alive because we do not know. And she said something recently that was, if I die tomorrow, remember me. That's something that Rifat, right, the poet Rifat also says, remember me. And that's something and remember my people, remember my cause, if nothing else. And that's something that Sharda Swaikar also
Right.
says.
We
Right?
survived because we had to live to tell these tales.
We had to survive because we had to live to tell these tales. And also, she also says, I survived because you needed me.
Right.
Right?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, and that I think is also a really, I think, unique way to also approach the archive. I think, and when I say we, I mean scholars, critics, curators, some artists even sort of imagine the archive as this sort of static thing that you go into and access and retrieve, but you retrieve things from and then you learn lessons from the past. But one of the ways that your film, I think, disrupts the traditional notion of the archive is that it uses fictive elements. It uses something that we might term as fabulation, to invoke Saidiya Hartman, to actually not just fill in the gaps of what was lost and what is irretrievable, but also to consider, again, in a more affective dimension, the sense that something that is past or buried isn't just lost, but it can be much more proximate, because again, these people were living flesh and blood people. I think insofar as what you mentioned, that we don't know what is yet possible, that by the sort of annihilation of so many people by fascist states, by colonial states, what might have been could still be something that we can work toward, right? Like I guess like that to me is the perfect idea of solidarity, where it's just, again, not nostalgia, not just loss. And you approach that through a very diasporic lens, something that I thought was really kind of moving in some of your earlier work when you talk about diaspora is you invoke Stuart Hall. Diaspora is a loss, quote, it's not forever. Like that I think is a very productive way to think about history, where it isn't just not what hasn't been realized and what has been made irretrievable, but actually it's not forever, because we live in not just empty homogeneous time, but also, again, the past flashes up in all these different ways. There are ways in which I think history rhymes with the present, and those moments are what you tend to highlight in your films. And by making these things, by drawing these connections, by thinking about these in very formal terms, you really, I think, materialize the concept of the insovereign,
Yeah.
as you talked about.
Right, and that's the title of the Fred Moten essay, History Might Not Repeat Itself, but It Does Rhyme.
Right.
Which is, yeah, where he develops that notion of the insovereign. And it's something that he talks a lot about in his notion of fugibility, right? Fugitivity and fugibility, I guess. Fugitivity. And this idea of constantly not being contained, right? Always maintaining a practice of evading capture, which is to say, of kind of static ways of being and knowing and being known. And also, what happens when we get captured is we get co-opted, right? We get turned into pawns, we get turned into props. And so this ability to have a fugitivity and an effective fugitivity, which is to encourage others to also be fugitives, right? To also evade capture, is something I think about a lot in terms of movement spaces, not just literally, right? But also in not have, when we make the call for a ceasefire, right? We also must move beyond ceasefire. We also must move towards many other ways of calls to action, right? Which is not just contained or defined on someone else's terms, because to be fugitive is also to resist definition, to resist being defined by someone else, right? Which is to say, people like Sita Valej, who refused to have the revolution defined as only the victory of the MPLA, right? Things like that.
Right. And I think that's why the multiplicity of forms, the sort of expansive sense of collaboration that you have. I mean, I thought it was so moving to see at the end of your film people, writers and archivists and producers and all these different people across continents in Chennai, in Mumbai, in Portugal, in New York. By thinking and working collaboratively in the very, media that you work in, I think you also open up all these different spaces for praxis to enter and again, even in the space of working on your film, this temporary alliance, we could say, so many things blossom. I mean, our conversation today actually began a couple of years ago. And I was so kind of struck by how your films at the time were thinking through diaspora personally, but also synthetically across questions of caste, questions of poetics. Agha Shahid Ali reappears actually in this most recent exhibition. And it goes to show you that there are models that you're looking at and that you're taking from, but you're adapting it and making these new forms out of these models to at least show one possibility of thinking about of demonstrating fugitivity of one. This is one possible arrangement, and there are so many others that can be born through this kind of conviction. So
Absolutely.
I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tausif. I mean, it's incredible to always be in conversation with you. I don't know if we
should we
open it up for questions. Yeah, I don't know.
questions?
Wow. Thank you both so much for that dialogue. That was amazing to listen to. We do have several questions. So the first question is going to be from Resham. Resham, I will give you the chance to unmute.
Hi. Thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation and everything you spoke about regarding memory and the purpose of art in moments like these just really resonated. So, and I think my question was more just practical, like where to find additional information about Sita's life, if there even is, I know it can be hard to find, but yeah, just curious about that.
Yeah, there's a biography that was translated into English like a few years ago, maybe like 2021. But it's you'd have to order it online. It's not available in the US. And it's fairly comprehensive. It's, no offense to them, but not the best biography. It is a biography, but it's not, the best. There's also a film that was made by a Portuguese filmmaker called Sita, A Revolutionary Life or something like that. Very different than my work, but gives you some context around it, and also features interviews with Edgar Valej, her brother. Yeah, and you can kind of Google her name and things will pop up. But there's a documentary and then there's a biography, both of which I find to be highly insufficient. But they're there.
Well, so actually, this raises a really interesting question for me. So, like, do you just spend, when you're not teaching, when you're not, doing a lot of other things, do you just spend a lot of time like in the library? I mean, like I'm actually curious, like how much, as you said, like there are so many limits to archives and what can be accessed and what becomes unlocked or something like that. Do you just spend a lot of your time reading and writing?
I always feel like I should be doing more. I mean,
Yeah.
So yes, but also no, there's so much more to be, God, it's like I have too many books that are just piling up. And so yeah, I try as much as I can, but never enough, it seems.
Right. But it goes to show that, the film medium, this is another approach to knowledge, right? This is another way of learning. And I think, I see your work as, I mean, you are an educator quite literally, but it's instructive and it's also pedagogical. And I think you draw upon a tradition of, essayistic film that isn't afraid to be didactic, which I think is refreshing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Resham, for that question. And thank you, Tausif and Suneil, for that answer. The next question is from Meghana. Meghana, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute. One moment.
Hi. Yeah, quick question. Tausif raised this point about collaborations, multiplicity of forms and voices, and yeah, Suneil, thank you so much for the film. My question is, with the task of excavating a story that had so many perspectives and centers, was there anything you had to mourn in the editing process?
Oh God, so much. There's so much to still work on, and this is sort of a part of a feature length work, or hopefully will be feature length work. It's like an iteration of it, but there's so much. Yeah, I mean, especially in the process of collaboration with Shami Ali, who brought so much. She brought, I mean, quite literally, there were moments where we were both just like devastated, and and we were working on this well ahead of the events of October 7th, but really she was also channeling so much pain, being a Muslim woman and from India, and the sort of slow rolling genocide of Muslims in India, which is not to equate that with the situation in Gaza, obviously, but to say that there's also this immense amount of pain that is suffered by by Muslims in India right now with the ethno-nationalist regime that exists. And so she was channeling so much. I mean, I don't want to speak too much for her, but she was channeling a lot. It was something we spoke about a lot. And so it was also, there were times where we had to cut certain things out of the script. There were entire narratives that we were trying to craft, and other interviews that didn't make it in. And so there's so much that didn't make it in that could have. And that just means that there's more to work with and more to work on. But certainly, quite literally, in a process of mourning, this work is in response to that mourning as well, and perhaps activating it in some sense. She sort of, in her script, draws upon a lot of, especially towards the end of the script in the film, draws upon a lot of references to the Quran, right? And so there's a lot of this mysticism that exists, that are as sort of like Easter eggs, which is kind of incredible for people of people who study the Quran, or of Muslim faith, right? Or Muslim or Islamic faith. And so there's things that I'm constantly discovering about the work too, or not discovering, but sort of approaching differently. So yeah, I guess the question, I'm unsure of exactly how to answer your question, but I think that that's how I responded to it.
Thank you so much for that question, Meghana. And thank you for that answer, Suneil. The next question is from our friend GE, and Eleanor is going to ask on GE's behalf today.
Thank you so much, Suneil and Tausif, for this amazing dialogue. It's been such a crucial space today, and every day. And yeah, I'll ask GE's question on his behalf. GE wrote, because you know that language is a representation of reality, which we use unconsciously, is becoming aware a way of decolonizing our language part of your project? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to like the debates over language that Ngugi wa Thiong'o brings up, right? And he wrote that Decolonizing the Mind back in, when was that, Tausif? Was that the 90s, or was that, I think it was the 90s, because
Yeah,
it was in response, it was in debate with Chinua Achebe. But yeah, in Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about reclaiming the mother tongue, right? And this working in opposition to English. So this entire film is in Konkani, right? The only English that's spoken is when Edgar Valej is speaking, and that's because I'm not fluent in Portuguese. There's Portuguese. There's also, but predominantly Konkani. There's a little bit of Hindi in there too. But it's predominantly Konkani, which is my father's mother tongue, my father's language. Which, as I write in the essay for the Brooklyn Museum about the show, um, the Konkani, his language, was outlawed in the 1600s. You were not allowed to speak Konkani, and but it was still spoken clandestinely, right? Otherwise, my father wouldn't be fluent in Konkani. It was not something he passed down to me, though. And I think many diasporic folks might be able to relate to that, because it's literally like not spoken outside. I mean, it's sort of spoken outside of Goa, but not really, right? It's maybe some traces elsewhere, because Goans as a diaspora are very international in many different places. But it's also a sort of dialect of Marathi. And so Marathi is a much more popular language. It's the language that a lot of Goan writers would use. So anyway, there was a very intentional decision to have Konkani be the primary voice that the film was in. And I worked with this actress, Tilia Fernandez, who is someone when we were scouting. The requirement was that they were fluent in Konkani, because in Goa you have a lot of people from outside of Goa who live there, both Europeans and also other Indians who kind of go there for their vacations because it's such a paradise. And so the requirement was someone who is, as we say, local.
Thank you. Thank you, GE, for that question.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks, GE, for that question. I'll ask the last question today, Suneil. I am curious if you can speak about your use of two-channel film with the installation Two Refusals, and what that unlocked for you and what you were exploring in the film and then the themes of the film.
Yeah, the two-channel was something I've kind of always wanted to do it and engage in it. I think about other artists that I am inspired by, people like Jonna Kumfra and Black Audio Film Collective, as well as people like Mantia Diawara, who often works in two-channel, and a lot of practitioners of multi-channel video. I think it can be quite effective, and it really helps to produce this dialectical tension between images that pure montage doesn't always achieve. It opens up new possibilities of this kind of contradiction in images, or conflict, right, of images, as well as there's a fluidity between the channels where the images will then sync up together at different times and produce a cohesive image. So it's constantly this unfolding, and it's like an ebb and flow, perhaps, right? The sort of waxing and waning of this relationship between unity and dispersal, right? So yeah, that's how I think about it a lot. There's also a gap in between the images. There's like a 6-inch gap where there's just this void in the image. And I had a friend who was like, that space in between those images is where actually everything happens, is that void in between the two, which I think is interesting.
I love that. I love that interpretation. Well, I have so much gratitude for you, Suneil, and for you, Tausif, for this conversation today. Thank you as well for your help preparing all the slides for the audience to see today. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsors this program and makes this program possible every day. And if you're free on Monday, we'll have another conversation at 1 p.m. with artist John O'Connor and novelist Rick Moody. And I encourage you to check our events page for the upcoming events. And as is real tradition, I'll give you all a chance to unmute now and say hello and goodbye to Suneil and Tausif as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tausif. That was
Thank you,
incredible.
Suneil. Thank you, Tausif.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.